All right, section 3, glycogen loading. This is module 6. And in this section, if you were to look at the history of glycogen loading, there's been a lot of research out there on glycogen loading. If you were to look at the history of glycogen loading, the first protocol was created by a fellow by the name of A. Strand. And what A. Strand had his athletes do is he actually ran them to exhaustion till they totally depleted their glycogen stores, and then they started adding those carbohydrates back in the days leading up, the last week leading up to the event. So 7 days out, they totally depleted their glycogen stores, and then they added them back in as they got closer to the competition. We know that we don't necessarily need to do that anymore. We've definitely evolved in the area of glycogen loading. And so in the 80s, there were studies out that said, well, we really don't need to deplete the glycogen levels. Just the fact that we're reducing our training intensity and we're eating maybe a normal diet, maybe a little extra carbohydrate, that's going to do the trick, right? That's going to do the trick for us, because by backing off on your exercise and eating a little more carbohydrate, that's going to lead to what they call supercompensation of the muscle with glycogen. And then as you get closer to the event, because you're even tapering more in those last couple of days, or possibly even taking some rest days in there too, you're increasing your carbohydrates slightly. And in the past, they've really amped up, in the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, really were promoting eating quite a bit of carbohydrate. And I don't know that I do that. I would suggest, because I've seen too many times that athletes eat too much carbohydrate in the days leading up, because in an effort to carb load, they eat too much and they gain weight before the event. Because you think about it, if you're really tapering off your activity, you don't need as many calories, right? I would just say increase your carbohydrate intake slightly, or not even really at all. Well, most of the athletes now that I talk to, the top athletes, they really don't change a whole lot. Maybe they eat 50 grams more carbohydrate. Even that's 200 extra calories of carbohydrate. And when you do eat a little extra carbohydrate, what you see is that it may make you feel a little heavy, because the carbohydrate, the glycogen, for every gram of glycogen, you get like 3 or 4 grams of water. And so that weighs you down a little bit, makes you feel heavier. But once you get out there during your competition, whether it be an endurance competition or a strength and power sport activity, then after a while you start to feel better, because excess water will help you, stay hydrated a little bit. So some of the research even more recently has looked at the fact, do we even need to glycogen load? Higher glycogen storage concentrations now have been achieved in as little as 24 hours, 36 hours. You don't need to do this 7-day out loading strategy, or even a 3-day out loading strategy. Like I said, a lot of the athletes that I see now, maybe they just focus a little bit on the carbohydrates, eating a little more, 50 grams, even 100 grams is a lot. You're talking 400 extra calories. I don't know that you need that much of carbohydrate. You definitely want to make sure your tanks are topped off, no question about it, but you don't need to really do anything out of the ordinary. That's what they always tell you, right? In your events, make sure you're doing everything the same. Don't change anything. And this is something you want to practice before your workouts and practice before your training sessions, to make sure that it's going to work for you. You can't just show up the day of your event or race, expect something to work that you've never tried before. So, have a simulation day where you eat the same thing the night before that you're going to during your event the next day, and see how that works. Carbohydrate loading doesn't always translate to improved performance. There's no doubt about it. You can have your glycogen stores loaded and full, but that doesn't always translate to improved performance, because competition and performances are multifactorial. There's a lot of things that could play into how you perform. Maybe your training leading up to the event was poor. Maybe you're just not in it mentally during the activity, and you lose focus. Those types of things, or maybe you're coming off an injury. Those types of things can affect your outcome, right? The way you perform. And so it has nothing to do with your glycogen, being stored. and I get this a lot too, is there really a need to carbo load for a 5K? And the answer is no. Bless their heart, and it's more of a social thing, and I get it. They have these big pasta parties the night before a 5K. They get together, and usually they oftentimes will eat too much. They think I've got a glycogen load for this 5K. But remember, glycogen loading is really for helpful in sports that where the activity is going to last more than an hour and a half. And so if your activity doesn't last more than an hour and a half, it's really not going to have that major effect. No need to glycogen load for a 5K. And, I've done some crazy stuff in my past too, talking about glycogen loading and trying to top off your tanks. And there's just no reason, I would do some crazy stuff like put like power bars and Cliff bars next to my bedside and set my alarm for 2 a.m. and then wake up and, when the alarm goes off and reach over to my nightstand and grab the bar and eat it while I'm laying in bed, just to make sure my glycogen stores are topped off. Again, as I look back now, it's one of those things I didn't necessarily need to do. All it really got me was some missed sleep. That just is a little bit about glycogen loading. There's definitely some advantages to glycogen loading, and you definitely want to make sure your glycogen stores are topped off. And there's no real way to measure that, by the way. But you're just trying to focus a little bit more on carbohydrate. Don't go out of the ordinary from what you normally would do. Don't load up and eat, 500 grams of carbohydrate the day before the race. That's not going to help either, right? With this type of realistic approach, I think you can achieve the results you're looking for in your next event. So let's end it there, and we'll see in the next section looking at nutrient timing.